Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on navigating global market access, your journey to the EMEA market. My name is Kate Moore.
And my name is Ida Recoso, and we are part of the Global Market Access team here at TUBSO, the UK.
The European, Middle Eastern and African EMEA region represents a vast market for wireless devices, but obtaining the necessary regulatory approvals can seem like a complex process. So in this webinar, we'll provide you with an overview of the different schemes to simplify the process for you. We will cover the regulatory landscape, the specific requirements you need to meet, and the different approval processes you will encounter. We'll also provide you with strategies to help you navigate the approval process efficiently. You will then be able to raise any questions or particular concerns you have at the end of the webinar in our Q&A session. As you can see, we'll be covering the Middle East, the different ways countries approach certifications, before closing things off with South Africa and the main considerations for this region.
By the end of this webinar, we want you to have a clear understanding of the type approval processes in the EMEA region and feel confident in bringing your product to this market. To help us navigate the regulatory requirements across the EMEA region, we have created a sample product, introducing the Guardian Link, a versatile device that can be attached to the keychain or jackets featuring GPS, cellular, and WLAN capabilities. The Guardian Link is designed to enhance the personal safety by tracking your location and alerting authorities when you feel unsafe or require emergency assistance. In the EMEA region, most regulators align closely with EU requirements. This means that generally EU test reports and technical compliance files are sufficient to demonstrate compliance for certification processes. For the Guardian Link, we have outlined the standards on this slide that we expect to be covered by the relevant reports. If you are integrating a module, it's important to note that EMEA regulators still require RF test reports for the final product. So please ensure that you conduct radiated emissions testing, as module reports typically cover only conducted testing requirements.
So given the Guardian Link's wireless capabilities, it will need approval from multiple regulators in the region. So let's begin our journey by exploring how the Middle East would approach certifying this particular product. So now, as we mentioned earlier, there are a number of regulators in the Middle East who accept EU test reports as evidence of compliance. Some examples here include Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, and Qatar. However, it's important to remember that these countries all have varying validity periods for their certifications, so you'll need to stay on top of every expiry date to avoid any issues at customs later on. An important point to note is that these approvals don't automatically allow for importation, so instead they typically act as a demonstration of compliance that contributes to your importer's application to clear a shipment. There's also specific labeling requirements for some countries in the EMEA region. We'll touch on these as we go throughout the webinar, but fortunately all the countries we just mentioned on this slide are exempt from any additional labeling requirements on top of CE marking. So the same can be said for the next group of Middle East countries. So Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen all have similar approaches to compliance, but it's important to be aware of the current political situations in these countries. For instance, following the explosion in Beirut, Lebanon's regulator, the TRA, is still working to get back to full functionality due to some political issues. Similarly, the regulator in Gaza, Palestine, is also not currently operating. Yemen is also undergoing consistent levels of instability, often knocking out phone and internet networks, so delays are very common here. While their processes on paper appear very straightforward, do expect delays here and potential suspensions of certification activities due to these ongoing developments. Moving on to a more stable country, let's now turn to Oman. So Oman's approach to compliance involves a paper-based process, but there are some key differences to be aware of. Unlike the previous countries we just discussed, Oman has a national labeling requirement that must be applied to the equipment before import. Additionally, if your product is a cellular product like the Guardian Link, you'll also need a GSMA TAC certificate, TAC certificate. Make sure the product details you apply align with the TAC certification, as these have to be consistent for both certifications. And then finally, while the manufacturer can hold the certification, it's really important to note that a notice of compliance, or NOC, needs to be issued to your local importer to be able to import your products. This NOC letter can be obtained at the initial release of the approval or later upon request. It's crucial to ensure you have this NOC letter obtained, otherwise the certificate is essentially only useful as evidence that your product is compliant. So do be aware here.
Let's now move on to another country with a slightly more complex approval process, Israel. Israel has two separate schemes covering different requirements. The Ministry of Communications oversees wireless requirements, and the Israeli Standards Institute presides over the safety requirements. There are some good news for those of you with Bluetooth-only products, because these products are exempt from approval. However, all of the technologies will likely require certification, so we need to obtain an approval for GuardLink in this case. Similar to Oman, your local importer needs to be involved in the process in Israel. Here, it's taken a step further, and your importer must actually hold the certificate themselves. Therefore, if you're planning to sell in Israel, make sure you have a suitable importer able to hold the approval. Once your importer is on board, the process remains primarily paperwork-based, and EU test reports are generally accepted. However, it's important to be aware that some bands are restricted in Israel, such as devices using RFID or 5 GHz WLAN. To use certain bands, you will need to add the IL suffix to your model number to show that the product has been adjusted to comply with the Israeli requirements. In this case, for GuardLink, we'll be looking at band 4 of the 5 GHz to avoid adding this suffix. For some manufacturers, this will be an all that is required for this approval. But if your device has a voltage above 9 volts or above, it will fall under the scope of the Israeli Standards Institute and will require local testing in the country to the safety standards. Here at Tubsud, we understand navigating these complexities can be sometimes challenging. That is why we have a MRA in place with a local testing partner in Israel. This agreement allows us to use Tubsud test reports data to remove the requirement for local testing, simplifying your market access process. So moving on now to Saudi Arabia, which has a similar setup to Israel. Much like Israel, there are two key regulators in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia: the Communications, Space and Technology Commission, CST, and the Saudi Standards Metrology and Quality Organization, SASO. The CST scope covers radio equipment, and the SASO covers everything else, basically. For products in CST scope, the manufacturers can hold the approval and remain a simple paperwork process. However, the validity is 2 years, and there are e-labeling requirements for mobile devices, whereas for other devices, the CE labeling is sufficient. So you need to be aware to check the labeling requirements for your product. Since the GuardLink's main function is for security and not for telecommunications, it's likely that the CST approval would not be required, but it does need to remain compliant with the CST technical specification, even if no certification is needed. We can obtain a formal confirmation from the regulator that it is out of scope upon request. Since this product won't be certified, but the CST SASO approval is required. There are a number of different SASO schemes, but depending on the product, either safety and/or ROX test reports will be required as evidence of compliance. The list of products that fall into the ROX assessment scope is shown on the slide. If you don't have a ROX test report, a risk assessment is accepted instead, which can provide guidance on how to complete it. Our team at Tubsud Middle East are a SASO certification body, so they are on hand to assist where needed. However, in regards to safety compliance, the SASO standards are direct equivalent to the IEC standards, so safety reports reflecting the standards will be sufficient. Now, very much like Israel, for SASO, the local importer must hold the approval, and approval can be either per shipment or covering the product. So if you are planning on shipping once, it might be easier to obtain a single approval, but we will need commercial invoices and shipping documentation to proceed with this. Now, next door to Saudi Arabia, we have the United Arab Emirates, whose schemes follow a similar approach. So I'll give it over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Syria. So now, like Saudi Arabia, there are two regulators, the TDRA and the MOIT. For all wireless products, TDRA's certification must be obtained, so no exemptions like the CST in Saudi Arabia. So the Guardian link would need approval under this scheme. There are a few more steps, however, to obtaining this certification, namely that the manufacturer has to have a registered account with the regulator, which provides manufacturers with a dealer's license. Additionally, due to the UAE's security processes, two-factor authentication is needed, which comes via their UAE Pass app. As such, a relevant person in the team needs to hold the TDRA account and have an associated UAE Pass account. TDRA's account also allows for customs release requests, so this is something that comes in handy for other users. So once you're all set up, the application process is typically quite straightforward, with EU reports and documentation being sufficient. However, from discussions with our colleagues in the UAE and the regulator themselves, they are seeking to implement local testing. So it is very likely that samples will be requested more and more as they develop their capabilities here. So do be on the lookout for this. Now, for some products, they would fall under the MOIT schemes, ECAS and EQM. The vast majority will fall under ECAS, which is document-based process, but they do typically require safety and/or ROSH test reports for review and is more complex than the SASO scheme. For products falling into the EQM scheme, an on-site factory audit is also needed here. However, we have a very competent team who can help guide you through all of these schemes step by step. Now, that covers the Middle East and hopefully provides an overview of the various approaches regulators take when looking to certify products for import and sale. We're now going to take a look at the rest of the EMEA region, but as mentioned at the start, these are going to be grouped by how they approach approvals, starting with the regulators that accept paperwork-only applications with EU test reports, which Iria is going to walk us through now.
To start at the top of the continent, we have Morocco, a country that has a straightforward paperwork-only process where EU test reports are sufficient as an evidence of compliance, and approval certificates have indefinite validity. However, it's important to note that for Morocco, the DOC needs to either be in Arabic or French in accordance with Moroccan national regulations, not EU, to be accepted, so please ensure that this is provided or handled as part of the application. As for the labeling, the CMIM mark is mandatory for all non-telecom products, and the ANRT's marking is required for following receipt of an approval from them. They require the certification number and the date of certification to be listed on the product. So now let's move east and take a look at Egypt. Egypt gets slightly more complex with three different schemes: light, intermediate, and tight. They are determined by a number of criteria as shown on the flowchart on the slide. Following some recent changes made by the NTRA, the main focus of the ISO certification of manufacturers. For any manufacturers with the ISO 17025 certification or MC testing, you can now go straight to obtain the certification with a simple paperwork process under the light scheme. For everyone else, slightly different criteria applies. Namely, if you have an equivalent ISO certification for quality management and product design, and you are located in any of the countries listed under the light section on the slide, you can also proceed with a simple paperwork process. However, for everybody else, another layer of criteria applies, whereby if you have manufacturing in any of the light countries, you proceed with an intermediate scheme, which is an approval per shipment rather than per product. However, if you have physical manufacturing your product in China or India, you will need to follow the tight scheme. The tight scheme requires testing to be carried out at an NTRA accredited lab, usually located in China or India, or one of those labs need to sign of for an ILAC accredited test reports that you have already obtained. As an example, our colleagues in India at TÜV Southeast Asia are NTRA accredited. So you can either carry out your full EU testing with them, or you can carry out your testing in any other TÜV facility, and they will authorize and issue a verification of conformity certificate for these reports. Additionally, for those of you who transfer data, Egypt has strict rules in place where Egyptian data must stay in Egypt and cannot be sent to international servers. So again, make sure you have some procedures in place to ensure this. For Guardian Link, we would be following the light scheme, but would need to ensure that the GPS tracking is processed in Egypt and not abroad. Now we're going to dip our toes into the simple approvals, starting with Zambia. Zambia is a nice, straightforward certification scheme requiring submission of European documents and test reports and basic product information. However, they are the first of the approval African countries who has a labeling requirement. Upon release of the approval, the regulator, ICTA, will provide you with the labeling artwork as shown on the screen here, which requires their logo and the certification number to be on your product before you import into the country. So make sure that you have your product appropriately labeled before you start importing and selling in the country. Now we're going to jump into the main bulk of countries in Africa who follow a simple paperwork process with not much differences between them. This is going to be a quick overview, so if you have any questions about the specific countries that we are going to cover next, do pop them into the question box and we will address them at the end. So now we're going to start off with the countries on this slide showing that accept EU paperwork as an evidence of compliance and will issue a certification on the basis of that. So just outlined here, there are basic set of documents that they are typically requested from regulators like this. You will need to ensure that you have an EU DOC, EU RF test reports, EU EMC test reports, safety test reports, user manual, photos, and potentially block diagram. All done and ready to go before we start looking at submitting applications to these authorities. Once these documents are with the regulators, they carry out a review of them and check that everything aligns with the accepted standards and limits, and then finally issue an approval certificate. As you can see, the majority of them have different validities, varying from 1 year to 10 years to indefinite. So we need to make sure to keep an eye on this so you don't run out of validity and get penalized for importing without the valid certificate. There are a few notes on these countries that you can see. The main one is Ethiopia, who requires a hard copy application for submission, and in some cases, sample. Although this request is on a case by case, so it's likely that it won't be required. As long as the lead times in this country can vary depending on how long it takes for the documents to arrive, and also to carry out the review of the documentation provided. One thing we need to take note of, though, is that GPS is restricted technology in Ethiopia, so we will need to disable that technology to obtain the approval for our product Guardian Link. Moreover, in Equatorial Guinea, there are many exemptions for products, particularly short-range devices, but we'll be looking at this Equatorial Guinea, but not for lots of the other products. Let's move swiftly now to another group of countries. As you can see, much like the first group, these countries follow a similar vein, although they have a lot more indefinite validities. So fortunately, we will only need to certify Guardian Link once for its lifetime. The exception is Mozambique, where you have a validity for 8 years. Now, be aware, although these countries are all paperwork only, they do always reserve the right to request a sample for review. So don't be surprised if a regulator suddenly turns around and asks for a sample, particularly if a sample happens to be a desirable product. So that wraps up the easy countries, and now we are going to delve a little deeper and take a look in the paperwork countries with a few catches. The big one being local holders, which we know causes some issues for many manufacturers. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Iria. So for local holder, in terms of type approval, some authorities don't issue certificates in the name of foreign companies. In this case, manufacturers are required to provide a local company to be the holder of the certificate, which is typically referred to as a local holder, or in some cases, a local representative. So some countries, however, require that this local holder is the actual local importer, since they're responsible for bringing the product to market. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the countries that require this. So first, we're going to take a look at the country Sierra Leone. Their regulator, NATCOM, again follows a paperwork-only process requiring just EU test reports. However, they need the local importer or local entity to hold the approval. Ideally, this should be your local importer, but most certification companies, such as TÜV Süd, can provide local holders upon request. Again, similarly to Zambia, they have their own labeling requirements, which requires the regulator NATCOM's logo and the certification number once the certificate has been released. As such, you can't prepare your labels until you have the certification completed. Next, let's move on to Cameroon, who again has a very similar process, but they have a validity of 3 years and accept EU labeling. The only catch with this country is that they tend to have a much longer lead time and are very slow at responding. So do make sure you obtain the certification sufficiently in advance of any sales targets you may have. The next 7 countries on this slide again require a local holder. However, do watch out if you manufacture smartphones, tablets, or computers, as the Democratic Republic of Congo may require a functional sample for review as part of the application. Otherwise, apart from that, all of these countries still accept the usual set of EU paperwork. Now, following on from these countries, we have Mauritius, who has a slightly more tricky process. So due to some recent changes in the regulations, local importers must now handle the submission themselves. And so this is not something TÜV Süd or any type of approval company can really support going forwards, as it all has to be done via an online portal. However, they have reduced the number of products in scope. So as you can see on the list, it's principally maritime equipment, outdoor wireless equipment, and telemetry and tracking equipment. However, your importers should be able to maintain this for you in the country. So, Iria, now let's take a look at more complex countries in the region where local testing is required.
Thank you, Kate. When we're talking about testing, there are 2 groups that we are going to discuss. The first are countries that just require sample for functional testing, and the second is the countries that actually carry out testing locally. To ease our way into this section, we are going to cover the functional testing countries first. First off, we're going to cover Benin, and then Chad and Togo, as they are all very similar, as you can see on the table on the slide. Starting with Benin, whose regulators require an as-sold sample to review before releasing the final approval. On their side, Chad and Togo also follow these steps. Additionally, please note that all the validities of these certifications is 5 years, so you will need to renew every 5 years to the regulator to keep the approval valid. However, in instances where the sample is too big or cannot physically be shipped to the country easily, we can get an exception to testing and proceed with the paperwork-only approval. Moreover, given that it is a functional testing only, there's also still require a full test of EU reports and associated documents, much the same way as the paperwork applications that we discussed earlier. So just because you're submitting a sample doesn't mean that you don't need to provide any technical documentation. We're going to now take a look into a look closer to the functional sample review countries with Kate.
Thanks, Iria. So next we have Niger and Guinea-Conakry, who differ slightly to the other countries, although ultimately their process is the same. Firstly, with Niger, they only require samples if the product is a smartphone, computer, or tablet. Any other devices typically don't need to be submitted. So luckily for us, the Guardian link is hopefully off the hook today, and we can just submit a paperwork-only application. However, samples are often requested on a case-by-case basis. As such, TÜV Süd typically requests a sample just in case this happens. Additionally, Niger has a longer validity period than in Chad and Togo, with the validity being 10 years. So for most manufacturers in this case, for the lifetime of your product, you would only need to approve it once, unless you are seeking to keep your product on the market for longer than a decade. Moving on now to Guinea-Conakry, the ARPTC, the regulator, also requires an as-sold sample here. However, there are no exemptions, and so all products fall into their testing scope. Fortunately, though, for manufacturers in this case, Guinea has an indefinite validity, so you only have to do the certification process just one time. So now that we've covered those countries, let's now move on to our next country, which is slightly more complex than the countries we've covered so far, and that is Algeria. So Algeria has two regulators, the ANF and also the ARPCE. So let's take a look at these two regulators and see how they differ from one another. So firstly, let's start with the ANF. Their scope only covers products that do not connect to a public network. These are typically devices with Bluetooth, RFID, and NFC. Conversely, the ARPCE approves devices that do connect to a public network. These would be products with technologies such as Wi-Fi, cellular, or Ethernet. As such, our Guardian Link would need to be approved by the ARPCE in this case. Fortunately, to keep things a little bit simple, both regulators have a validity for their approvals of 3 years and a very similar labeling process whereby you would need to indicate who the product's been approved by, as well as the approval number. As you can see here on the screen, the exact wording differs slightly depending on the regulator you obtain your approval from. Now, as we mentioned earlier, this is a full review country, so you would just need to submit one as sold unit to the regulator for testing. However, again, much like the other countries, there's a set of documentation you need to submit to the regulator as part of their overall review, and there are two key documents that you need to keep in mind here for Algeria. So firstly, they require a wet, signed and stamped EU DOC. So this means you need to physically put pen to paper and sign another copy of the EU DOC and send that hard copy and ship it to the regulator directly. In addition to this, they require a certificate of origin from a Chamber of Commerce. So please make sure you have these documents ahead of time and ready to go before you submit to the regulators for approval. Otherwise, it could just cause quite a lot of delays and you might not be able to meet sales targets on time. So do be aware of this. Additionally, this is another country that technically requires a local importer to hold the approval. A manufacturer can obtain approval in their own name. However, this would then need to be extended to your local importers for use. So lead times in this country are typically quite long again, mainly due to the backlog of work at the regulators due to how much hard copy applications and documentation they have to deal with, and the time it takes to physically get the documents and the samples shipped into the country. So do just keep an eye on this and be aware of this when looking at lead times. And now let's move on to the countries that actually do a degree of testing when certifying the product. So let's start now with Tunisia. So similarly to Algeria, Tunisia technically has multiple regulators. It has fortunately simplified the process so you don't have to submit to 3 regulators and you only need to submit to just the one. So the CERT cert is the main body in Tunisia who accepts the submission of documents and samples and then obtains all the required approvals in a one-stop submission process. So although there is one regulator, there are 2 different types of approvals you can obtain from Tunisia. The main one is issued by the CERT themselves, and another is issued from an ANCE. So the CERT or CERT issues approvals for all devices that have no data encryption, whereas the ANCE requires approval for devices with data encryption. If your device has encrypted and unencrypted technologies, like, for example, with our Guardian Link product we have today, as it has cellular and Wi-Fi technologies, you would be issued with 2 approvals at the end of the certification process. So when submitting to Tunisia, there's a few things that you need to be aware of. Firstly, that you, of course, need to provide a sample for the review. In terms of testing, it's a little bit more than a functional review in that they require a conducted sample. However, they are ultimately just connecting the sample up to a test bench and verifying the frequencies it operates in before carrying out a basic review of the product's functionalities. So for those of you who are using multi-channel and multi-band technologies such as 5 gigahertz, you need to be very aware of the frequency bands that your product uses, because in Tunisia, they have certain bands that are locked. So if during testing it's found that the product can operate outside of the permitted bands of the country, there will be a flat out rejection of the product and you will have to resubmit and repay for everything all over again. So before you submit, do check with TÜV that your device is locked correctly before we ship the product out for the testing review. Another thing to be aware of when products are being approved in Tunisia is that the approval is only officially valid for the company holding the approval. So ideally, the approval needs to be held in the name of your importer. However, there are a means of obtaining the approval in the manufacturer's names, and then authorizations can then be granted to importers. So now I'm going to hand you back over to Iria, and let's round things off with the final country, which is Tanzania.
Thank you, Kate. Tanzania's regulator TCRA requires testing for all cellular and set-top products. For these products, they request a single conducted sample with SMA connectors added to each antenna and a SIM card slot to add a testing SIM card. The regulator typically conducts a variety of conducted tests, including occupied bandwidth, RF output power, EVM, and ACLR testing, prior to conducting a full review of the EU test reports to confirm they align with the requirements. Once everything is confirmed, they will release an approval which has an indefinite validity. The entire process takes around 6 to 8 weeks, and you will make sure that you include the label as shown on the slide. It's quite similar to the Algeria, but it just needs to be done in English. Now we're going to move on to a final set of countries, and I send it back to you, Kate.
Thanks, Iria. Now, these are the countries that you'd probably are likely to hear about most, and these are all the overseas territories of EU countries or have no requirements at all, as showed on the slide now. Therefore, provided you have carried out your EU testing and your product is appropriately CE marked and declared, you can start importing and selling in these countries from tomorrow. However, there is just one country that we do need to flag, which is South Sudan. So due to sanctions, there is no importing or selling right now for obvious reasons. However, should this ever change, we'll be sure to let you know and advise on the specific requirements that are needed for that territory. So that now wraps up our main review of the countries. And before we close things off today, we're going to cover one final country where we have a little bit more to talk about, and that is South Africa. So I'm going to pass you back over to Iria to cover this country.
Thank you so much, Kate. Let's have a look into the South Africa that has 3 type approval schemes that cover all the requirements we have been speaking about during this presentation. There's one regulator for each of them, and the test report you will be obtaining for EU. ICASA covers products with RF capabilities, NRCS covers the safety, and SABS covers the remaining EMC. Now, for both ICASA and NRCS, they accept your test reports for review as part of the application. So again, it's a simple process. However, for both of these, they require a local holder. With the NRCS, this needs to be the actual local importer. So moving on, we need to say also that ICASA has some labeling requirements as shown in the slide, and the NRCS just simply accept the CE marking. Before we move on to SABS approval, I want to touch on the fact that whilst there are 3 regulators, you don't necessarily have to get the 3 certifications in South Africa. For the product that we have here, the Guardian Link, given that it's relatively low power device, it's likely that it will only need ICASA approval. However, for a higher power product or products where telecommunications isn't the main use, NRCS approval might also be required. So you need to make sure to check with your supplier whether your product falls into both of the schemes, the 3 of them, which is one. For products that don't fall into either of those schemes, it's likely that you will fall into the South African Bureau of Standards approval, SABS. There are 2 ways to obtain an approval depending on how fast you want it in this case. So firstly, if you want a quick turnover, you will have to get your EMC test reports done by the SABS accredited body to SANS standards. Once you obtain these reports, however, you can then carry on with the paperwork-only process, and it's again quite straightforward application. If you don't have this, you can still use test reports from an ILAC accredited lab to EU standards, but SARS have advised that they will have longer lead times when reviewing this kind of reports.
Thanks so much, Iria. So now that we have covered the EMEA region, let's just summarize the main points that we would have to consider for the Guardian link in the EMEA region as a whole. So, as we previously mentioned, EU reports are typically accepted and EU compliance is generally sufficient for most EMEA countries, though RF test reports are required for the certification of end products. Regarding documentation, ensure all your necessary EU test reports and other documents are ready for when you want to certify your products, unless, for example, you're at the early stages and want to use TÜVSÜD, for example, to help you with your testing, as well as your global market access. But be aware of special national requirements. As mentioned throughout the presentation, not all EMEA countries have the same rules and regulations, and specific national requirements could apply, for example, labeling and local testing requirements. So do be on the lookout for those, or ask us if you're unsure. For some countries, multiple schemes could apply, so make sure your product complies to all applicable schemes, for example, South Africa, as Iria just mentioned. Furthermore, importer involvement is often necessary, with some needing to hold certification. So do allow time to find the local importer you need for certification, whether that be your local branch or a third party. And we do recommend you find your local importer ahead of time to give yourself plenty of time for the certification process. Lastly, do remember that once you receive the final certificate to start your importation process, some certificates do not have indefinite validity, and a renewal process could be required here. If you carry out your certification with us at TÜVSÜD, we will send you advance warning on your expiring certificates in plenty of time before they need to be renewed. And then finally, do remember that an approval isn't an automatic acceptance to import. For example, like we discussed when we were talking about Oman with the NOC letter, you may need to take additional steps as well as having the type approval certificate. So do be on the lookout for those. So now that wraps everything up for today, and I do hope you found this session to be extremely useful. We're going to now cover a few of the questions that people have written on the screen, so we'll have a look at those. Let's just have a look.
Hi, this is really interesting here. Is renewing the validity of a certificate a simpler process than getting the approval in the first place? Usually, the process of renewing is normally a lot simpler. So in the cases that sample is required, usually for renewing is a paperwork only process. And also for the renewal, you don't need to access all the, you need to apply all the documents that you provide in the first place. It's usually just getting a sample of the certificate that you provided in the first place. And it's usually a more straightforward process.
Perfect. Thanks, Siri. I think I've got another one here about given the number of labels required, what do you do if your product is too small or your product or you don't have enough space? Sorry. So this is a really quite an interesting question. So sometimes if your product is too small, it really depends on the country. Some countries will allow for you to put your label onto the product packaging instead. Or for example, if the product is too small, you're allowed to put the label on the user manual or e-labeling, for example. One thing I will say is that a lot of manufacturers forget is that if you have a huge amount of labels, but there is a small amount of space on the product for a label, when shipping that product into the country, the authority will want you to prioritize their label over others. So if there is space for labels, you might have to consider just making sure that label for that particular country is the main focus. You might have to swap labels out depending on where you're shipping the product to. But a lot of the time, as I mentioned, you can put the label instead on the product packaging or on the user manual, but you're welcome to come to TÜVSÜD and ask us this, and we can help you ahead of time and let you know where the label can be best placed. Let's have a look, see if there's any more questions. No worries. Let's just have a look. There's one question here about.
Yes, you go on.
Oh, no, that's okay. I think I was going to say a similar question. Yeah, I think so. So they're asking which bands are locked in Tunisia. Iri, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, yes, thank you, Kate. In Tunisia, bands 3 and 4 are disabled for the 5 gigahertz WLAN. So what this means is that if you have a product with these bands, you will need to lock them when seeking to certify, for example, in our case, the Guardian link. But if you have a certain product you're looking to certify with different technologies, there's no problem. Just get in touch with us and we can tell you exactly what you need to do to overcome this restriction of funds.
Perfect. Thank you, Iri. I think there's a last question as well here on the testing in the UAE. So what kind of testing is the UAE looking at doing? So I believe it's going to be similar to Tanzania. So conducted samples will likely be requested in the UAE. This is something that, as we mentioned, they're just starting to talk about this and bring this out. And at the minute, testing is a case by case basis. So at the minute, it's something that we're having to do every time we do a certification in the UAE. It's something we have to ask each time. But I think as the rules and regulations start to come out more, this will be clear of what they want. But as I said, it is similar to Tanzania. So conducted samples will likely be requested on this basis. But as the regulations change and we get more updates, we'll definitely inform you about what's going on and what samples will be needed and how many. I think that is all we have time for today. Is there any more? I can't see any more, I don't think. I think that's everything. Iri, is there any more on your side? I can't see any more.
I think we can close for the time.
Perfect.
If you have any others, you can send it to us.
Yeah, if you have any other questions, do send us, do email us on the last slide. We've got the slide up now, which has our email addresses on. So do ping us an email if you have any questions or concerns or any questions on specific countries or questions after today's session. And we'll happily come back to you via email. And then do let us know and send us an email if you want a copy of the slides as well. And we can send those over to you. But yeah, thank you very much for your time today. We hope you found this session extremely useful. And thank you to Iria for joining us as well. And have a good day, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.